The violent wail of a baby echoed through the rickety walls of Nora Ellis's small cabin on the outskirts of Wheatland, Wyoming Territory, 1876. Her trembling hands clutched the swaddled infant tighter as tears of frustration and exhaustion streamed down her dirt-smudged cheeks. 3 nights without sleep had left dark circles under her once vibrant hazel eyes, and her auburn hair hung in limp strands around her pale face. Little Thomas had been colicky since birth 6 weeks ago, but tonight seemed worse than ever, his tiny face scrunched and red as he screamed relentlessly into the darkness. "SHH, SHH, my love," Nora whispered, her voice cracking as she paced the wooden floorboards that creaked beneath her worn boots. "Please, Tommy, please sleep." The lamp on the table flickered, casting long shadows across the sparse furnishings: a small bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair by the potbelly stove where she'd spent countless hours trying to soothe her son. The sound of approaching hoofbeats outside barely registered through the baby's cries. Nora tensed, instinctively pulling Thomas closer to her chest. Living alone since her husband's death 4 months ago had made her wary of unexpected visitors, especially at this late hour. She reached for the shotgun propped against the wall, though her exhausted state made her movements sluggish. 3 sharp knocks on the door made her jump. "Mrs. Ellis," a deep voice called out. "It's Samuel Sutton from the Silver Dollar Ranch," heard the little one all the way from the trail. "Everything all right in there?" Nora hesitated, recognizing the name of the ranch hand who'd helped with odd repairs around her property a few times since Jacob's passing. He'd always been polite, if not a bit reserved, tipping his hat and refusing payment despite her insistence. "Just a moment," she called, awkwardly balancing Thomas in one arm while she unlatched the door with her free hand. Samuel Sutton stood on her porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. His dark hair peeked out from beneath his weather-worn hat, and concern etched lines around his blue eyes as he took in her disheveled appearance. At 32, he was 7 years her senior, with a reputation as one of the hardest workers and best horse trainers in Wheatland. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "Riding back from town and heard the crying, thought I should check in." Thomas let out another piercing scream, and Nora couldn't stop the sob that escaped her throat. "He won't stop," she said, her voice barely audible. "He hasn't stopped for 3 nights, and I don't know what to do anymore." Samuel's gaze softened as he looked at the wailing infant. "May I come in?" Nora stepped back, allowing him into the cabin. The rifle still stood against the wall, but her instincts told her this man posed no threat. "Have you eaten, Mrs. Ellis?" Samuel asked, noticing the empty kettle on the stove. She shook her head, bouncing Thomas gently. "I haven't had time to," her voice broke again, exhaustion overwhelming her. Samuel nodded, taking in the situation with calm assessment. He'd seen plenty of hardship in his life, starting with losing his parents to typhoid when he was just 16 and spending the years since working ranches across the frontier. But something about this young widow's struggle stirred something deep within him, a protectiveness he hadn't felt in a long while. "You sleep," he said simply, reaching for the baby. "I'll hold him till he does." Nora stared at him, disbelief crossing her features. "What?" "You heard me," Samuel replied, his voice gentle but firm. "You're dead on your feet, Mrs. Ellis. I can hold a baby just fine. My sister had 4 little ones I helped with before I came west." She hesitated, clutching Thomas closer. "I couldn't possibly ask. You didn't ask. I offered." He held out his large, calloused hands. "Trust me, madam, you need rest more than anything right now." Maybe it was the exhaustion clouding her judgment, or perhaps it was the sincere concern in his blue eyes, but Nora found herself carefully transferring her screaming son into the cowboy's arms. Samuel adjusted the swaddling blanket with surprising deftness, cradling Thomas against his broad chest. "Now get some sleep," he instructed, nodding toward her bed. "I'll watch over him." Nora meant to protest, to insist that she couldn't possibly leave her child with a man she barely knew. But the moment she sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of her exhaustion crashed over her. She glanced at Samuel, who had already settled into the rocking chair, his large hand gently patting Thomas's back as he murmured something too soft for her to hear. "Just for a few minutes," she whispered, lying down fully clothed atop the quilt. Her eyelids grew heavy instantly, the sound of her baby's cries already seeming more distant as sleep pulled her under. When Nora next opened her eyes, sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window. She bolted upright, panic seizing her chest as she realized she'd slept through the night. "Thomas," she gasped, turning toward the rocking chair. Samuel sat there still, his hat on the floor beside him. Thomas was nestled peacefully against his chest, both of them sound asleep. The cowboy's hand rested protectively on the baby's back, his head tilted slightly to one side. On the table nearby sat a pot of what smelled like coffee and something wrapped in a cloth. Nora rose quietly, her muscles aching from days of tension finally releasing. She approached the sleeping pair, her heart constricting at the sight. Thomas looked so tiny against Samuel's broad chest, his little hand curled against the man's shirt. The baby's face was peaceful for the first time in days. As if sensing her presence, Samuel's eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, then offered a small, tired smile. "Morning, Mrs. Ellis," he whispered, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. He finally settled around dawn. "You stayed all night," she said, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. Samuel nodded. "Said I would." "I don't know how to thank you," Nora replied, tears welling in her eyes. "I haven't slept more than an hour at a time for days." "No need for thanks," he said, shifting slightly in the chair. "Made some coffee before he fell asleep, and there's bread and cheese I brought from my saddlebag. Figured you might need something to eat." Nora moved to the table, unwrapping the cloth to find a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. "You didn't have to do that. Neighbors help neighbors out here," Samuel replied simply. "That's how we all survive." As Nora ate, she studied the cowboy more carefully in the morning light. His face was weathered from years working outdoors, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and his hands, while gentle with Thomas, showed the calluses and nicks of hard ranch work. "Mr. Sutton," she began hesitantly, "I truly appreciate what you've done, but I can't help wondering why you'd go to such trouble for us." Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking down at the sleeping baby. "I know what it's like to be alone when times get hard," he finally said, "and seems to me you've had more than your share of hard times lately." He paused. "Jacob was a good man. He spoke of you often at the saloon, always proud, as could be about his wife and the baby that was coming." Nora's throat tightened at the mention of her late husband. "He was so excited about becoming a father," she whispered. "He never even got to meet his son." Samuel nodded solemnly. "Life out here can be cruel that way." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the soft crackling of the stove and Thomas's occasional sleepy sighs. When the baby finally stirred, making small snuffling noises against Samuel's shirt, the cowboy carefully adjusted his hold. "Looks like someone's waking up," he said with a small smile, "and I reckon he'll be hungry." Nora set down her coffee cup and approached them, taking Thomas into her arms. The baby opened his eyes, blinking up at her, but instead of the immediate wailing she'd grown accustomed to, he merely yawned and nuzzled against her. "He seems different this morning," she observed, relief evident in her voice. Samuel stood, stretching his long limbs after the night in the chair. "Sometimes they just need a change of arms," he said, reaching for his hat. "Well, Mrs. Ellis, I should be getting back to the ranch. Mr. Henderson will be wondering where I've been." "Please," she said quickly, "call me Nora." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Nora, then." "And I'm Samuel, or Sam if you prefer." "Sam," she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." He settled his hat on his head, adjusting the brim. "No repayment necessary. But I'd be happy to check in on you and the little one from time to time, if that would be all right." "I'd like that very much," Nora replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Sam nodded, moving toward the door. "I'll be by tomorrow evening then, after my work's done." He paused with his hand on the latch. And Nora, if he starts crying again and won't settle, try wrapping him a bit tighter and holding him against your chest while walking. Sometimes the movement and your heartbeat is what they need." With that, he slipped outside into the morning sunlight. Nora moved to the window, watching as he mounted his chestnut gelding and tipped his hat once more before riding away. Thomas cooed softly in her arms, seemingly content for the first time in days. "Well, Tommy," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead, "seems we've found ourselves a friend." True to his word, Sam returned the following evening. Nora had spent the day cleaning the cabin and washing her hair, telling herself it was simply because she wanted to appear more presentable after the state he'd found her in, not because of the way his blue eyes had lingered on her face or how safe she'd felt knowing he was watching over her son. When he knocked on the door, Thomas was already fed and dozing in the small cradle Jacob had built before his death. Nora smoothed her skirts nervously before opening the door. Sam stood on the porch, hat in hand, his dark hair slightly damp as if he'd washed up before coming. In his other hand, he held a small burlap sack. "Evening, Nora," he said, his deep voice warming something inside her. "How's the little fella today?" "Much better," she replied, stepping back to let him in. "He's actually slept more today than he has in weeks." "Whatever magic you worked seems to have helped." Sam's mouth quirked into a half smile. "No magic, just experience." He held up the sack. "Brought you some things from town, some tea Mrs. Henderson swears helps with colic, and a bit of fresh meat for your supper." Nora blinked back unexpected tears at the thoughtful gesture. Since Jacob's death from a fever that had swept through the area last winter, she'd grown accustomed to handling everything alone. The simple act of someone thinking about her needs felt foreign yet desperately welcome. "You shouldn't have," she said, accepting the sack, "but thank you." Sam glanced around the cabin, his eyes landing on the cradle where Thomas slept. "Mind if I take a look at him? Promise I won't wake him." Nora nodded, watching as the tall cowboy moved quietly across the room and peered down at her son. Something about the tenderness in his expression as he looked at Thomas made her heart constrict. "He's a fine-looking boy," Sam said softly. "Has your nose, I think." "And his father's chin," Nora added, moving to stand beside him. "Jacob was so proud when I told him I was expecting. He had all these plans." Her voice trailed off, the familiar ache of loss washing over her. Sam straightened, turning to face her. "It's not right what happened to Jacob. He was a hard worker, honest man. This land takes too many good people too soon." "Sometimes I wonder if I should give up and go back east," Nora admitted. "My sister in Boston has offered to take us in, but this place, this cabin, it's all I have left of Jacob and the dreams we shared." "The West isn't kind to those who face it alone," Sam said thoughtfully, "but there's something to be said for building something that's yours." He paused. "Would you mind if I looked at your roof before I go? Noticed some loose shingles when I rode up." "You don't have to, I know I don't," he interrupted gently, "but I'd like to if you'll let me." Nora found herself nodding, grateful beyond words. For the next hour, she sat on the porch with Thomas in her arms, listening to Sam moving about on her roof, hammering loose shingles back into place. There was something comforting about the rhythmic sound and knowing someone was looking out for them, even temporarily. When he finally climbed down, his shirt was dusty and a fine sheen of sweat covered his brow despite the cool evening air. "Should hold now," he said, wiping his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Those spring storms were starting to do some damage. Would you stay for supper?" Nora asked impulsively, "It's the least I can offer after all you've done." Sam hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be honored." As Nora prepared the venison he'd brought, she found herself telling him about her life before Wheatland, how she'd met Jacob back in Illinois when they were both 20. How they'd married against her parents' wishes and headed west with dreams of building a life where land was plentiful and opportunities endless. She told him about the difficult journey, the first harsh winter in the cabin, and the joy when they'd realized she was expecting. Sam listened attentively, asking questions at the right moments and sharing bits of his own story in return, his childhood in Missouri, losing his parents young, working his way westward from ranch to ranch, learning to break horses from an old Mexican vaquero in Texas. Never thought to settle anywhere permanent? Nora asked as they finished their meal. Sam's expression turned thoughtful. Used to think I'd know the right place when I found it, then the years just started slipping by. He glanced around the small cabin. What about you? Will you stay here? As long as I can manage it, she replied, determination edging her voice. Jacob had 20 acres partially cleared before he fell ill. I've been trying to keep up with what I can, but it's too much for one person, Sam finished for her, especially with a young one to care for. Before Nora could respond, Thomas began to fuss in his cradle. She rose to get him, but Sam was already on his feet. May I? He asked. She nodded, watching as he carefully lifted her son, supporting his head with a practiced hand. Thomas's cries immediately softened to whimpers as Sam cradled him against his chest, walking slowly around the room. You're a natural with him, Nora observed. Sam smiled, a full smile that transformed his usually serious face. Like I said, my sister's children taught me well. 4 of them under the age of 6 when I last saw them. You miss them? Every day, he admitted, hoping to bring them out here someday once I have something to offer. Nora was struck by the longing in his voice. For all his capability and strength, Samuel Sutton was a man who carried his own share of loneliness. The realization created an unexpected bond between them. Thomas settled quickly in Sam's arms, his tiny hand clutching the cowboy's finger. The simple domestic scene stirred something deep within Nora, not just gratitude, but a flicker of something she wasn't ready to name. I should be heading back, Sam said eventually, reluctantly transferring the now sleeping Thomas back to his cradle. Henderson wants us moving cattle to the north pasture at first light. Of course, Nora replied, walking him to the door. Thank you again for everything. Sam placed his hat on his head, hesitating at the threshold. I'll be by again in a few days, if that's all right. Want to make sure that roof's holding proper. We'd like that, she said softly. After he'd gone, Nora stood in the doorway watching until his figure disappeared into the darkness. For the first time since Jacob's death, the night ahead didn't feel quite so long or lonely. The days lengthened as spring fully took hold of the Wyoming territory. Sam's visits became a regular occurrence, always with some practical reason given, a repair that needed attention or supplies he happened to be bringing from town. But as April turned to May, the pretense grew thinner. He would stay for supper, then linger afterward, helping with Thomas or simply talking as the baby slept. Nora found herself looking forward to these evenings more than she cared to admit, even to herself. She told herself it was natural to enjoy adult conversation after long days alone with an infant. She ignored the way her pulse quickened when she heard hoofbeats approaching, or how she'd taken to checking her appearance in her small mirror before he arrived. On a particularly warm evening in early May, Sam arrived with 2 rabbits he'd caught and a handful of wild onions. Thought we might have a proper stew tonight, he said, handing them to Nora. She noticed the "we" immediately, how naturally it had slipped from his lips, as if their shared meals had become an expected part of both their lives. That sounds wonderful, she replied. Thomas is already asleep for once. He's been much better since, she stopped herself from saying, since you came into our lives. Since he's gotten a bit older, she amended quickly. If Sam noticed her hesitation, he didn't show it. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves. Let me help you with those, he offered, taking the rabbits back and moving toward the small table where he began to clean them with practiced efficiency. They worked side by side preparing the meal, moving around each other in the small space with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity. When their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for the knife, Nora felt a jolt of awareness that made her step back quickly. Sorry, Sam murmured, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before returning to his task. During supper, he seemed unusually quiet, and Nora wondered if she'd somehow made him uncomfortable. Finally, as they finished their meal, he cleared his throat. I've been meaning to ask you something, he began, his fingers fidgeting with his coffee cup. Your land, you mentioned you haven't been able to work much of it. No, Nora confirmed, disappointment washing over her. Was this what had been on his mind, some business proposition? The vegetable garden is all I can manage with Thomas needing so much attention. Sam nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking, the silver dollar's slow this time of year. Henderson wouldn't mind if I took some time to help you get a crop in on those cleared acres. Nora stared at him. That's too much to ask. You didn't ask, I'm offering. His eyes held her steadily. Jacob wouldn't want all his hard work clearing that land to go to waste, and a good crop could mean security for you and Thomas through the winter. I couldn't pay you, she said softly, wasn't looking for payment. Sam set down his cup. But if you're worried about propriety, maybe we could work out a share arrangement. I provide the labor and seed, you provide the land. We split whatever comes of it. Nora considered his offer. Having crops would indeed make a significant difference in their survival through the next winter. And Sam's presence around the property more regularly would help with the constant repairs an isolated cabin required. People will talk, she said finally, voicing her main concern. A slight smile touched Sam's lips. People always talk in small towns. Question is whether what they're saying matters more than what you need. His practical approach made sense, but Nora knew there was more to her hesitation than concern for gossip. Having Sam Sutton in her daily life would make it harder to ignore the growing feelings she harbored for the quiet cowboy feelings that brought both hope and guilt. It had been barely 6 months since Jacob's death, and yet here she was, her heart stirring for another man. I need to think about it, she said finally. Sam nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course, no rush. He stood, reaching for his hat. I should head back, it's getting late. As he prepared to leave, Thomas began to cry from his cradle. Nora sighed, moving to pick him up, but Sam was already there, lifting the baby with familiar ease. Hey there, little man, he murmured, his deep voice instantly soothing the infant. What's all this fuss about, Chem? Nora watched as her son's cries subsided, his little hand reaching up to pat Sam's bearded cheek. The tenderness in the cowboy's expression as he looked down at Thomas made her throat tighten with emotion. He knows you now, she said quietly, recognizes your voice. Sam nodded, a curious vulnerability crossing his features. He's a good boy. He carefully handed Thomas back to her. Think about my offer, Nora, no obligation either way. After he'd gone, Nora sat in the rocking chair with Thomas against her shoulder, thinking about Sam's proposition and the implications of accepting it. Part of her worried what the town would say about a widow allowing a single man to work her land. Another part, the practical part, recognized the opportunity it presented, but the part that kept her awake long after Thomas had fallen back asleep was the one that wondered if Samuel Sutton might be offering more than just help with her crops. 2 days later, Sam returned as promised. Nora had made her decision, though anxiety still fluttered in her stomach as she spotted him riding toward the cabin. Afternoon, he called, dismounting from his horse. He carried a large burlap sack across his saddle, which he hefted down with ease. What's that? Nora asked, stepping out onto the porch with Thomas in her arms. Seed corn, Sam replied simply. Henderson had extra, thought it might be useful regardless of what you decided. He approached the porch, his expression carefully neutral. Have you thought about my offer? Nora took a deep breath. I have, she met his gaze directly. And I accept with one condition, Sam raised an eyebrow. What's that? We draw up a proper contract. Everything in writing, just like any business arrangement. That way, if anyone in town has anything to say, we can show them it's all above board. A slow smile spread across Sam's face. That's fair. I'll ride into Wheatland tomorrow and have Mr. Parsons at the land office draw something up. He hefted the sack of seed corn. Where would you like this for now? The storage shed around back, Nora directed. And Sam, thank you. He nodded once, something warm in his eyes before carrying the seed toward the shed. Nora watched him go, wondering if she'd made the right decision but feeling, for the first time in months, a sense of hope for the future. Over the next few weeks, Sam spent every available moment at Nora's property. True to his word, he'd had a formal sharecropping agreement drawn up, which they'd both signed in the presence of Mr. Parsons, giving the arrangement an air of legitimacy that helped quiet most of the town gossip. The work was hard but satisfying. Sam arrived at dawn most days, worked until the heat became too intense around midday, then returned to the Silver Dollar for his regular duties. Some evenings he'd come back, especially if there was more to be done or repairs needed on the cabin or outbuildings. Nora found herself settling into a new routine. While Sam worked the fields, she tended her vegetable garden with Thomas napping in a makeshift cradle nearby. Sometimes she'd bring Sam water or coffee, watching as he worked the plow with steady determination, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. On one particularly hot afternoon in late May, Nora approached the field with a pitcher of cool water. Sam had removed his shirt entirely, his tanned skin glistening in the sunlight as he worked. She stopped short, momentarily transfixed by the sight of him, the broad shoulders, the lean strength evident in every movement. Heat that had nothing to do with the Wyoming sun flushed through her body. When he spotted her, Sam grabbed his shirt from where it hung on a nearby fence post and quickly slipped it on, though he left it unbuttoned. "Sorry," he said, wiping his brow. "Didn't expect you to come out in this heat." "Thought you might need some water," Nora replied, her voice slightly higher than normal. She held out the pitcher, trying not to stare at the expansive chest still visible through his open shirt. "Thank you kindly," he said, accepting the drink gratefully. After taking a long swallow, he asked, "Where's Thomas?" "Sleeping in the house. I can hear him if he cries." She gestured toward the open window of the cabin. "How's it coming along?" Sam's face brightened as he surveyed the turned earth. "Good, real good. Should have all 10 acres planted by end of the week if the weather holds." He handed the pitcher back to her. "Your husband chose good land, Nora, rich soil here." She nodded, a familiar pang of sadness mixing with something else, pride, perhaps, that Jacob's dream for this land might still come to fruition, even if he wasn't here to see it. "He would have liked you, I think," she said softly. "Jacob, I mean. He always respected men who knew how to work the land." Sam was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I respected him too," he finally said, "even though we didn't know each other well." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark. Nora found herself studying Sam's face, the way the sun had deepened the creases around his eyes, the straight line of his nose, the fullness of his lower lip partially obscured by his neatly trimmed beard. "What?" he asked, noticing her scrutiny. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just, thank you." "For all of this?" Something shifted in his expression then, a softening around his eyes. No need for thanks between friends. The word friends seemed to hang in the air between them, somehow both accurate and insufficient. The cry of Thomas from the cabin broke the moment. Nora stepped back, clutching the pitcher. "I should go to him," Sam nodded, "and I should get back to work." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be by this evening to fix that loose board on your porch, been meaning to get to it." "Supper will be waiting," Nora replied, the invitation now a given between them. As she walked back to the cabin, she couldn't help glancing over her shoulder. Sam had returned to his plowing, his movements strong and sure. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Jacob's courtship. A feeling that both frightened and exhilarated her. That evening, as Sam sat across from her at the table, Thomas contentedly dozing in his cradle nearby, Nora found herself wondering what it might be like if this were permanent, these shared meals, this companionable silence, this sense of partnership that had developed between them. "Penny for your thoughts," Sam said, breaking into her reverie. Nora smiled, shaking her head slightly. "Not worth that much, I'm afraid." "I doubt that." His blue eyes held hers across the table. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Nora Ellis. More sense than most men I've worked with over the years." The compliment warmed her. "My father always said I was too opinionated for my own good. It's partly why he didn't approve of Jacob, thought I needed a husband who'd keep me in line." Sam's mouth quirked upward. "Can't imagine anyone keeping you in line if you didn't want to be there." Nora laughed, surprised by how good it felt. "No, I suppose not. It's a quality I admire," Sam continued, his voice growing serious. "A woman who knows her own mind." The atmosphere in the small cabin seemed to shift, the air between them charging with something unspoken. Nora looked down at her plate, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. "More coffee," she offered, rising to retrieve the pot from the stove. "Please." Sam watched her movements as she refilled his cup. "Nora," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Yes," she prompted, returning to her seat. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing, just, I'm glad to be helping you with the land. It's good work." Nora sensed there had been something more he'd wanted to say, but she didn't press. Whatever was growing between them was still too fragile, too uncertain to name outright. "Will you be able to come tomorrow?" she asked instead. "There's a storm brewing according to Mr. Peterson at the general store." "I'll be here," Sam assured her. "Might come earlier, try to get more seed in before the rain hits." As he prepared to leave later that evening, he paused at the door. "Lock up behind me," he instructed, his voice carrying a protective edge that made Nora's heart flutter. "And if that storm gets bad, take Thomas and go to the root cellar just to be safe." "I've weathered Wyoming storms before," she reminded him with a small smile. "I know you have." His expression softened. "Still, I'll rest easier knowing you're being cautious." On impulse, Nora reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for caring, Sam." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. For a breathless moment, Nora thought he might lean down and kiss her. Instead, he gently returned the pressure of her fingers before releasing her hand. "Good night, Nora," he said softly, settling his hat on his head. "See you at dawn." The storm arrived the following afternoon with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of Nora's cabin. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that made the windows rattle in their frames. Thomas wailed in fear at each thunderclap, and Nora held him close, murmuring soothing words while anxiety knotted her stomach. Sam had arrived before sunrise as promised, working frantically to get as much seed in the ground as possible before the storm hit. When the first fat raindrops began to fall around noon, he'd come to the cabin, soaked and muddy. "Should I go?" He'd asked, clearly reluctant to leave them as the storm intensified. "No," Nora had replied quickly. "Please stay." The thought of facing the violent storm alone with Thomas had filled her with dread. Now, as the wind howled around the cabin and rain lashed against the windows, she was profoundly grateful for Sam's solid presence. He moved about the small space with quiet efficiency, checking windows for leaks, stoking the fire to ward off the sudden chill, and even managing to coax a smile from Thomas between thunderclaps. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed by the sound of something heavy falling nearby, Sam frowned. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the door. "Where are you going?" Nora asked, alarmed. "Just checking the roof. Sounded like something might have hit it." He grabbed his hat. "I'll be quick." Before she could protest, he slipped outside into the downpour. Nora moved to the window, peering out anxiously as Sam made his way around the cabin, looking up at the roof through the driving rain. After what seemed an eternity, he returned, water streaming from his clothes and forming puddles on the wooden floor. "Tree limb came down on the corner," he reported, shaking water from his hat. "Knocked loose some shingles, but the damage isn't too bad. I'll fix it once the storm passes." "You're soaked through," Nora observed, concern evident in her voice. She set Thomas in his cradle and retrieved a blanket from her bed. "Here, take off that wet shirt before you catch your death." Sam hesitated, then complied, unbuttoning his sodden shirt and shrugging it off. Nora tried not to stare at his bare chest as she handed him the blanket, but the sight of him water glistening on his skin, the defined muscles of his torso, the scattering of dark hair narrowing down past his waistband, made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. His eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their blue depths. Nora busied herself hanging his shirt near the stove to dry, aware of a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. When she turned back, Sam had settled in the chair near the fire, the blanket still draped around him. "You should sit," he said, nodding toward the other chair. "No sense standing while we wait out the storm." Nora checked on Thomas, who had remarkably fallen asleep despite the thunder, then joined Sam by the fire. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance in the stove. "I was thinking," Sam said eventually, his voice low. "Once the crop is in and growing well, I might look into getting a place of my own." The statement surprised Nora. "You're planning to leave the Silver Dollar," Sam nodded slowly. "Been there 3 years now. Henderson's a good boss, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "A man gets to a point where working someone else's land doesn't satisfy anymore." "Where would you go?" Nora asked, a sudden tightness in her chest at the thought of Sam leaving Wheatland. "Not far," he assured her, his eyes meeting hers. "There's land available just north of here. Good grazing land. Might be able to start small, build up a herd over time." "That sounds like a fine dream," Nora said softly, trying to ignore the relief she felt knowing he planned to stay in the area. "What about you?" Sam asked. "What are your dreams now, Nora?" The question caught her off guard. Since Jacob's death, she'd been focused solely on survival, on making it through each day. Dreams had seemed like luxuries she couldn't afford, I suppose. She began hesitantly. "I dream of security for Thomas. Of seeing this land produce the way Jacob imagined it would." She paused, then added more quietly, "And sometimes I dream of not being alone." The last words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge openly. Sam's eyes held hers across the small space, something warm and intent in his gaze. "You deserve that," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "All of it." A particularly loud crack of thunder broke the moment, causing Thomas to stir and whimper in his cradle. Nora moved to comfort him, lifting the baby and bringing him back to her chair. As she settled with Thomas against her chest, she noticed Sam watching them, a look of such longing on his face that it made her heart ache. "Would you like to hold him?" she offered. Sam nodded, extending his arms. Nora carefully transferred Thomas to him, their hands brushing in the exchange. The baby settled against Sam's bare chest, his tiny hand splaying across the man's skin in a gesture of complete trust. "He knows he's safe with you," Nora observed. Sam's throat worked as he swallowed. "Smart boy," he murmured, one large hand cradling Thomas's head. He looked up at Nora, vulnerability evident in his expression. "I never thought much about having children of my own. The life I've led, moving from place to place, didn't seem fair to a family. And now—" Nora asked, her heart pounding. "Now I'm starting to see things differently." His voice was soft but steady. "Starting to want things I didn't think were possible." The implications of his words hung between them, neither quite ready to bridge the final gap between friendship and something more. Instead, they sat together as the storm gradually subsided, the comfort of shared silence saying what words could not yet express. When darkness fell, it became clear the storm had washed out the trails too badly for Sam to safely return to the ranch. "You should stay here tonight," Nora said, practical, as they finished a simple supper of beans and biscuits. "The back room has a cot. It's not much, but it's dry." Sam nodded his acceptance, though something in his expression suggested he was conscious of the potential for gossip should anyone discover he'd spent the night under her roof. "I'll ride out at first light," he said, "before anyone's likely to notice." Later, as Nora prepared for bed with Thomas already asleep in his cradle, she heard Sam moving about in the small back room that had once served as Jacob's workshop. The knowledge that he was just on the other side of the wall brought both comfort and a restless awareness that made sleep elusive. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the occasional creak of the cot as Sam shifted position, wondering if he too found sleep difficult tonight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed stillness broken only by the steady drip of water from the eaves. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Thomas began to cry. Nora rose immediately, lifting him from his cradle and checking his diaper, which was dry. He continued fussing, refusing to nurse, his little face scrunched in discomfort. "SHH, my love," she murmured, pacing the small room. "What's troubling you?" The back room door opened, and Sam appeared, wearing only his trousers, his hair mussed from the pillow. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice husky with sleep. I'm sorry if he woke you, Nora apologized. I can't seem to settle him. Sam approached them, gently placing a hand on Thomas's back. May I? He asked, extending his arms. Nora transferred the fussing baby to him, watching as Sam cradled Thomas against his bare chest, his large hand supporting the infant's head. He began to walk slowly around the room, his deep voice humming a tune Nora didn't recognize. To her amazement, Thomas's cries gradually subsided, his little body relaxing against Sam's warmth. How do you do that? She whispered, incredulous. Sam smiled in the dim light. My sister used to say I had a gift for calming her little ones. Something about my voice vibrating in my chest seems to soothe them. Nora watched them, a powerful wave of emotion sweeping through her. The sight of this strong man holding her child with such tenderness in the middle of the night with no complaint stirred something profound within her. You're a natural father, Sam, she said softly. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. Never had the chance to be one, he replied, his voice equally soft, but I've thought about it more lately than ever before. The implication in his words was unmistakable. Nora's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and fear coursing through her veins. Was he suggesting what she thought he was? Before either could speak further, Thomas let out a small sigh and nestled deeper against Sam's chest, finally asleep. Sam carefully transferred him back to his cradle, his movements gentle and practiced. When he straightened, he found Nora standing closer than before, her eyes shining in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Thank you, she whispered, not just for tonight, but for everything the countless ways he'd supported her and Thomas over the past weeks. Nora, Sam began, his voice rough with emotion. I need to say something, and I hope you won't think less of me for it. She waited, her heart hammering in her chest. I know it hasn't been long since Jacob passed, he continued carefully. And I would never want to dishonor his memory or rush you into anything. But I find myself thinking about you and Thomas all the time. When I'm not here, I'm wishing I was, and when I am here, he paused, taking a deep breath. When I'm here, it feels like where I belong. Nora felt tears welling in her eyes, emotion closing her throat. You don't have to say anything now, Sam added quickly. I just wanted you to know, and to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd be honored to court you properly. The sincerity in his voice, the respect with which he acknowledged her grief and her need for time, only confirmed what Nora had been feeling for weeks. This man, who had entered their lives on a night when hope seemed distant, had become essential to her in ways she hadn't believed possible again. Sam, she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. I don't know what the proper time is for a widow's heart to heal. All I know is that Jacob would have wanted Thomas and me to be happy and safe. She took a steadying breath. And when I'm with you, we are both of those things. Something shifted in Sam's expression, hope replacing uncertainty. Are you saying? I'm saying I would welcome your courtship, Nora replied, her voice stronger now. Not because I've forgotten Jacob, but because life is too precious and too uncertain to deny what I feel. Sam's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle. And what do you feel, Nora Ellis? Hope, she whispered. For the first time in so long, I feel hope for the future, because of you. In the pale moonlight, with her sleeping son nearby, Nora lifted her face to Sam's. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tender yet charged with promise, the promise of new beginnings, of healing, of a future neither had imagined possible months before. When they finally parted, Sam rested his forehead against hers. I'll do right by you both, he vowed. Every day I have left on this earth. I know you will, Nora replied, believing it with her whole heart. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, they stood together in the quiet cabin, the sleeping baby a tangible reminder of the past they honored and the future they now faced together. The people of Wheatland had plenty to say when Samuel Sutton began officially courting the widow Ellis that summer. Some whispered it was too soon after Jacob's passing. Others speculated the arrangement had been in place even before the sharecropping agreement. But as the weeks passed and the corn grew tall in Nora's fields, the gossip gradually subsided. replaced by a grudging respect for the hard work evident on the previously neglected property. Sam continued to split his time between the Silver Dollar Ranch and Nora's farm, though he spent increasingly more nights in the back room of her cabin, his presence providing security and companionship. He was careful to maintain propriety, never taking liberties beyond the occasional stolen kiss when they were certain no one was watching. By August, with the corn ripening under the hot Wyoming sun, Sam approached Nora one evening as she sat on the porch watching Thomas, now 8 months old, attempt to crawl on a blanket spread on the grass nearby. "I have something to show you," he said, an unusual excitement in his normally calm demeanor. "Can you ride out with me tomorrow?" Mrs. Henderson said she'd be happy to watch Thomas for a few hours. Curiosity piqued, Nora agreed. The following afternoon, she found herself riding beside Sam on a borrowed mare, heading north along the creek that bordered her property. They'd gone about 3 miles when Sam slowed his horse, gesturing toward a rise ahead. "There," he said simply. As they crested the hill, Nora gasped at the sight below. A small cabin stood in a natural clearing, smoke rising from its chimney. A corral held several horses, and beyond it stretched acres of grass-covered hills. "Sam," she questioned, turning to him in confusion. "It's mine," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Bought it from old man Givens last month. He was heading back east to live with his daughter and wanted to sell quick." "But you never said wanted it to be a surprise," Sam explained, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Been fixing it up whenever I could get away. There's good water, decent grazing land, and room to expand." Nora stared at him, realization dawning. "This is the land you were talking about, your dream." Sam nodded, suddenly looking nervous. "Nora, I've been saving for years, waiting for the right time, the right place." He took a deep breath. "I think I've found both." He dismounted, helping her down from her horse. Taking her hand, he led her toward the cabin. "It's not much yet," he cautioned as they approached. "2 rooms, a decent fireplace, but there's space to add on." Inside, Nora found a simple but solid structure, recently cleaned and repaired. A table with 4 chairs stood in the main room, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a rocking chair similar to her own placed near the fireplace. "The bedroom's through there," Sam said, pointing to a doorway covered by a new curtain. "And I thought eventually we could add another room off the back for children." Nora turned to him, her heart racing at the implication. "Sam," he took both her hands in his expression earnest. "I know it's soon, I know people will talk, but I love you, Nora Ellis. I love Thomas as if he were my own son, and I want to build a life with you both." He swallowed hard. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Nora's eyes as emotion overwhelmed her. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate widow struggling to care for her infant son alone. Now she stood in a cabin built by a man who'd proven his worth not through grand gestures but through consistent, unwavering support when she needed it most. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hands. "Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Sutton." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any doubts she might have harbored. He pulled her close, his kiss filled with promise and barely restrained passion. "I was thinking October," he said when they finally parted, "after the harvest is in." "Would that be too soon?" Nora laughed, shaking her head. "Not soon enough." They married on a crisp October morning in the small whitewashed church in Wheatland. The harvest had been bountiful, providing Nora with enough income to purchase material for a simple wedding dress, pale blue rather than traditional white, a nod to her status as a widow, but also a symbol of the new beginning she embraced. Thomas, now 10 months old and attempting his first wobbly steps, was held by Mrs. Henderson during the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Sam kissed Nora with a restrained passion that nevertheless caused several of the church ladies to fan themselves vigorously. That evening, after a small celebration at the Hendersons' ranch, Sam brought his new family home to the cabin he'd continued improving throughout the late summer and early fall. He carried Thomas inside first, showing the curious baby around what would now be his home, then returned to the wagon where Nora waited. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sutton," he said, lifting her into his arms with ease and carrying her across the threshold. Nora wrapped her arms around his neck, happiness bubbling through her veins. "It feels right," she whispered, "being here, being your wife." "It is right," Sam replied, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "I've never been more certain of anything." Later, after Thomas had been settled in the small crib Sam had crafted for him in the corner of their bedroom, Nora stood nervously as her husband closed the bedroom door. Though they had grown close over the months of courtship, they had maintained propriety, never crossing the final boundary that would now be crossed as husband and wife. Sam seemed to sense her nervousness. "We have all the time in the world," he said gently, coming to stand before her. "Nothing has to happen tonight if you're not ready." Nora reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with tender fingers. "I am ready," she assured him, "just a bit nervous. It's been a long while since." Understanding dawned in Sam's eyes. "I'll be gentle," he promised, drawing her into his arms, "and we'll learn each other little by little." His kiss was slow and thorough, different from the restrained embraces they'd shared before. Nora felt herself responding to his touch, to the security and passion he offered in equal measure. As clothing was gradually discarded, and they came together as husband and wife for the first time, she found in Sam a tenderness that matched his strength, a patience that spoke of love rather than mere desire. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head pillowed on his chest, Nora traced idle patterns on his skin. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she confessed. "After Jacob died, I thought that part of my life was over." Sam's hand stroked her hair, his touch reverent. "Life has a way of surprising us," he replied. "When I rode up to your cabin that night and heard Thomas crying, I had no idea I was riding toward my future." "Our future," Nora corrected, tilting her face up to his. "Our future," Sam agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. The seasons turned, bringing changes to the Sutton homestead. The following spring found Nora heavy with child, her belly rounded beneath her apron as she worked alongside Sam planting their second crop together. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler of 18 months, followed his adoptive father everywhere, his little legs working hard to keep up with Sam's long strides. "Pa," he called one warm May afternoon, reaching up with imperious arms toward Sam, who was repairing a fence post. Sam froze, his hammer suspended in mid-air as he turned to look at the boy. "What did you say, Thomas?" "Pa," Thomas repeated, his face breaking into a delighted grin at having captured Sam's full attention. Nora, who had been hanging laundry nearby, felt tears spring to her eyes at the look of wonder and joy that transformed her husband's face. Sam set down his hammer and swept Thomas into his arms, holding him close. "That's right, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your pa." Later that night, after Thomas was asleep, Nora found Sam sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. She lowered herself carefully beside him, her advanced pregnancy making movement increasingly awkward. "You've been quiet tonight," she observed, taking his hand. Sam's fingers interlaced with hers. "Just thinking about how much my life has changed in a year and a half." He turned to look at her, moonlight silvering his features. "From a solitary ranch hand with not much to call my own to a husband, a father, a landowner." He placed his free hand on her rounded belly, and soon to be father again. Nora leaned into him, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence. "Are you happy, Sam?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied without hesitation. "Sometimes I wake up in the night just to make sure it's all real, you beside me, Thomas sleeping in his bed, this place we're building together." His honesty touched her deeply. "I feel the same," she admitted. "After Jacob died, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life just trying to survive, just trying to keep Thomas safe." She looked up at him, love swelling in her heart. "I never imagined finding love again, finding a partner who would accept us both so completely." Sam's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I remember that first night when Thomas wouldn't stop crying and you looked so exhausted." His voice softened with the memory. "All I wanted was to help somehow, to give you a moment's peace." "You gave me so much more than that," Nora whispered, emotion making her throat tight. "You gave us a future." In late June, as the corn stood knee-high in their fields, Nora gave birth to a son they named William after Sam's father. The labor was difficult, lasting through a hot summer night, but Sam never left her side, his steady presence a comfort through the pain. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in his arms, Sam looked down at his son with wonder. "He has your eyes," he said to Nora, who lay exhausted but radiant in their bed. "And your chin," she replied, reaching out to touch the tiny face. "Hello, William Samuel Sutton, welcome to our family." Thomas, now nearly 2, was initially wary of the new arrival, but under Sam and Nora's patient guidance, he soon became a proud older brother, bringing his toys to show the baby and patting his head with careful toddler hands. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of their growing family. Sam continued to improve their property, adding a third room to the cabin when Nora found herself expecting again in the spring of 1878. Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, arrived that November, completing their family circle. By 1880, the Sutton Ranch had expanded to include 60 acres of grazing land and 15 acres under cultivation. Sam had built up a respectable herd of cattle and added a small but productive apple orchard on the slope behind the cabin. The original 2-room structure had grown to a proper farmhouse with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. On a warm evening in late summer of that year, Nora sat on that porch, mending one of Thomas's shirts while watching her children play in the yard. Thomas, now 5 and growing tall like his stepfather, was showing 4-year-old William how to lasso a fence post. Baby Sarah, not quite 2, toddled after them on chubby legs, determined not to be left out. The sound of hoofbeats announced Sam's return from town. The children abandoned their game immediately, running toward their father with excited cries. Nora watched with a full heart as Sam dismounted, scooping Sarah up with one arm while using his free hand to ruffle the boy's hair. "Did you bring candy, Pa?" William asked, peering at Sam's saddlebags hopefully. Sam laughed, his face relaxed and happy. "Maybe I did. But first, help me unload these supplies for your mother." As the family worked together to bring in the flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities Sam had purchased in Wheatland, Nora marveled at how far they'd come. The struggling widow and the solitary cowboy had built something beautiful together, not just a prosperous homestead, but a loving family bound by choice as much as blood. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Sam and Nora sat together on the porch swing he'd built for their 5th anniversary. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaning against him as they watched fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "I got a letter today," Sam said, breaking the companionable silence, "from my sister in Missouri." "Oh," Nora looked up, interested. Though Sam corresponded regularly with his sister, they hadn't seen each other in nearly 10 years. "She's finally taking me up on our invitation," he continued, a note of excitement in his voice. "Her and the children, though they're hardly children anymore, they'll be coming for Christmas." "That's wonderful news," Nora exclaimed, genuinely pleased. She knew how much Sam missed his sister and her family. The children will be so excited to meet their cousins. Sam nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I was thinking we might need to add on to the house again, maybe that 2nd story we've talked about." Nora laughed, shaking her head affectionately. "Always building, always improving. Will you ever be satisfied, Samuel Sutton?" He turned to her, his eyes warm in the fading light. "I've been satisfied since the moment you said you'd be my wife," he replied, his voice low and sincere. "Everything else is just making room for more happiness." Nora's heart swelled with love for this man who had entered her life when she needed him most, who had held her crying baby through the night and offered her a chance at a future she'd thought forever lost. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "When you first came to my cabin?" "Often," Sam admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd taken a different trail home that night if I hadn't heard Thomas crying." He shook his head slightly. "But then I think perhaps some things are meant to be, no matter the path." "I believe that," Nora said, leaning up to press a kiss to his bearded cheek. I believe we were meant to find each other, to build this life together." Sam turned his head, catching her lips with his in a tender kiss that still, after all these years, sent warmth spreading through her body. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Remember what I told you that first night?" he asked. "When Thomas wouldn't stop crying and you looked ready to collapse." Nora smiled, the memory still vivid after all this time. "You said you sleep, I'll hold him till he does." "Best offer I ever made," Sam murmured, drawing her closer against his side. "Led me straight to everything I ever wanted." As darkness settled fully over the Wyoming landscape, the Sutton family slept peacefully in the home they'd built together, no longer a lonely widow with a crying baby and a solitary cowboy with dreams of someday, but a family bound by love, forged in hardship, and strengthened through the passing seasons of their shared life. In the years that followed, their story became something of a legend in Wheatland. How Samuel Sutton had ridden up to a widow's cabin one night, heard a baby crying, and found not just a woman and child who needed him, but the home his heart had been searching for all along.